In the heart of Westchester, behind the gates of a billionaire's mansion, a little girl lives in silence, afraid, unseen, unheard. Her name is Madeline. She's 6. Her father, Ethan Callahan, is too buried in work and guilt to notice. Until one day, a 12-year-old girl, the daughter of the cleaning lady, does what no adult dared. She stands up. For Madeline. For truth. What follows is a journey of courage, quiet defiance, and the kind of bond that can only be born in the darkest corners of a broken home. Stay with us, because some voices, no matter how small, can change everything. The porcelain cup hit the floor with a sharp crack, followed by the splatter of orange juice that quickly spread across the expensive rug. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Madeline stood frozen, her small hands shaking, eyes fixed on the growing stain. She knew what was coming before she even heard the footsteps. Victoria's heels struck the hardwood floor with sharp purpose. The woman appeared in the doorway with fire in her eyes, mouth already twisted into a sneer that never quite matched the elegant lines of her face. "You are unbelievable," she hissed. "Not even a glass of juice. What are you, 6 or brainless?" Madeline opened her mouth, but nothing came. There were no words she trusted to be safe. And before she could step back, Victoria's hand gripped her arm, hard, pulling her forward and shoving her toward the wall. The girl's shoulder struck the wood with a dull thud. Her body slumped to the floor, more in fear than pain. She had stopped registering pain weeks ago. What she feared was the yelling, the threats, the disgust. Estela heard the crash from the hallway. She had been helping her mother in the laundry room, folding towels that smelled of lavender detergent. But the sound made her gut twist. She moved quickly, barefoot and quiet, the way kids learn to be when they're used to not being noticed. What she saw when she stepped into the living room made her chest tighten. Madeline crumpled against the wall, Victoria towering over her, not shouting now, but saying something low and venomous. Estela didn't think. She walked in like she belonged there, like 12-year-olds were meant to interrupt cruelty. "Don't touch her!" The words came out louder than she expected, startling even herself. Victoria turned sharply, as if slapped by the sound. "This is none of your business," she snapped. "Get back to your mother." But Estela didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her hands balled into fists by her sides, not because she wanted to fight, but because she was terrified and trying not to show it. "She's a kid," she said. "You can't do that." Victoria let out a bitter laugh and took a step forward. "You think I need parenting tips from the cleaning lady's daughter?" Her voice was coated in venom. Estela didn't answer. She just stepped sideways, positioning herself directly in front of Madeline, who was now trembling, eyes wide with something between hope and panic. Estela didn't look back. She didn't dare. Instead, she stared at the woman she had seen smile so easily at dinner parties, a smile that now seemed carved out of cold glass. They stood like that, locked in a standoff, until the front door swung open. Ethan Callahan had returned earlier than expected. He paused in the entryway, briefcase still in hand. His gaze moved from Victoria to Estela and finally to his daughter, huddled on the floor. Something in his posture shifted. The air in the room thickened, not with heat, but with realization. "What is happening here?" he asked, voice low and tight. Victoria immediately straightened, smoothing her blouse like she could iron the guilt out of herself. "It was an accident," she said, gesturing with an elegant hand. "She tripped Ethan." She knocked over the glass, slipped. "Estela is just confused." Her tone was sweet poison. Ethan didn't move. He looked at Estela, his expression unreadable. She hesitated, knowing exactly how this would go if no one believed her. But something in her refused to stay quiet. "She pushed her," Estela said. Her voice shook but didn't break. "She does it all the time. She says things to her. Calls her trash. Says she's ruining everything." Each word was a stone she had to lift, heavy and dangerous. Madeline made a soft sound behind her, almost a whimper. Ethan's eyes snapped back to his daughter. Her tiny arms had wrapped around her knees. She wasn't crying. That was worse. She looked like she'd folded into herself. And then Madeline moved. She stood on uncertain feet and walked slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed. She crossed the space between herself and her father, and when she reached him, she didn't say a word. She simply buried her face in his stomach and clutched his shirt like a lifeline. Ethan dropped the briefcase. His hands hovered awkwardly before they settled on her back, holding her like something fragile he hadn't realized was breaking. He looked up at Estela again, and then at Victoria, who had gone very still. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that awful, sacred silence, the truth was finally louder than anything anyone could say, and Ethan understood completely that the home he'd tried to rebuild was nothing more than a beautiful cage for a daughter who had forgotten what safety felt like. Rosa had scrubbed that kitchen floor more times than she could remember, but that evening, the tiles felt foreign beneath her feet. Her hands moved by habit, not thought, wiping down counters and rinsing dishes that didn't need it, just to keep moving. Her daughter had stood up to Victoria Lang, in front of everyone, in front of Ethan Callahan, the man who signed her paychecks, who built empires with code and capital, and who rarely spoke more than a sentence when passing through the kitchen. And yet his eyes had landed on her, not with anger but with something far more unsettling: expectation, accusation, confusion. Had she known? Should she have spoken sooner? Rosa wanted to scream that she hadn't known everything, not clearly, not all at once. But hadn't she, in the quietest, most cowardly corners of her heart, suspected? The missing bruises, the flinches, the sad, careful silences of a little girl who had once been light and had dimmed like a candle under a glass. Rosa's pride in Estela's bravery clashed violently with the shame she felt for not being the one to act first. She had told herself for years that she was just the help. But tonight, that excuse felt like a betrayal. Upstairs, Estela sat stiffly on the edge of the guest bed, still in her shorts and t-shirt, her socks rolled down around her ankles. She was tired, but her mind wouldn't quiet. Madeline was lying beside her, curled up like a question mark, her eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. Neither of them had spoken since Rosa had led them to the room and kissed Estela's forehead. The air between the girls was thick, not with fear anymore, but with something slower, heavier. Estela glanced at Madeline and said softly, "You don't have to talk." That alone seemed to settle the tension. Madeline blinked, then slowly turned her head inch by inch until their eyes met. No smile, no tears. Just a gaze that said, "I know you were there." Estela reached out and held her hand. A simple, small gesture, one that spoke louder than the grown-ups downstairs ever could. She didn't understand everything that had happened, not in full, but she knew enough. She knew that for too long, Madeline had felt alone in a house full of people who didn't listen. And now, maybe for the first time in forever, she wasn't alone. Ethan had shut the study door, but he couldn't shut out the questions. He stared blankly at his monitor, the glow of an unread email casting a pale light on his face. Victoria had always known how to spin things, how to say the right words at the right time, how to deflect and smile and redirect with surgical precision. But no spin could erase what he had seen. His daughter crumpled, trembling, hiding behind the daughter of his housekeeper. A girl who barely came up to his chest had stood like a soldier, while he, the man meant to protect Madeline, had been blind. He could feel the weight of that failure pressing on his chest like a fist. How had he missed it? Was it his own grief that made him overlook the signs? Or had he wanted to believe so badly that Victoria could make them whole again that he'd let himself be lied to? He sat there for what felt like hours, hands folded, staring at nothing, lost in a truth too big to absorb in one night. His daughter hadn't turned to him for help. She had turned to a stranger, and that truth shattered him. Back in the servants' wing, Rosa sat on the edge of her narrow cot, knees drawn up to her chest. Her phone buzzed twice, messages from her sister back in Queens. She ignored them. She didn't have the energy to lie and say everything was fine. She thought about walking back up, checking on Estela, but something told her not to. Her daughter needed space, and more than that, she needed to feel like she had done something meaningful. Rosa couldn't take that from her. Instead, she prayed. Not to a saint or even to a god she fully trusted, but to something, to whatever spirit watches over children who have to grow up too fast and little girls who fight monsters behind white picket fences. She thought of Madeline's face, pale and silent, and of the echo of Estela's voice, brave and steady in front of Ethan. The world had shifted tonight. Lines had been drawn. And though Rosa was afraid for her job, afraid of what would come next, she knew one thing with painful clarity. She would stand with her daughter, no matter what. In the master bedroom, the bed was too large. Ethan sat against the headboard, arms crossed, staring into the dark. The sheets beside him remained untouched. Victoria hadn't come back, and he wasn't sure he wanted her to. Her perfume still lingered on the pillows, and that, more than anything, made him sick. He tried to recall the exact moment when her mask had started to slip, but nothing came. Had he been too absent, too preoccupied with the company, the appearances, the headlines? Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that healing meant moving on, that Madeline just needed time, but healing required safety, love, awareness. He had failed her in all three. A father is supposed to be the shield. Tonight, a stranger's daughter had taken that place. He rubbed his face with both hands, ashamed, furious, and more alone than he had been in years. And yet beneath the guilt, there was something else. Resolve. Tomorrow, things would change. They had to. But tonight, all he could do was sit with the consequences of his silence. In the guest room, the clock ticked past midnight. Estela had stretched out now, her arm still draped gently across Madeline, whose breathing had finally slowed. There were no words left to say. Just presence, just warmth. In the quiet, Estela stared at the ceiling and thought about how strange it was that the bravest thing she'd ever done didn't feel brave at all. It had just felt necessary. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, reminding her to stay out of grown-up business. But this wasn't business. This was a child, a friend, maybe even something closer than that. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like or if she and her mother would still have a job. But for now, for this one night, none of that mattered. Because tonight, two girls who should never have met in a world this divided were holding on to each other like lifelines. And though neither of them would sleep, neither of them would face the night alone. In the days that followed, silence settled over the Callahan estate like a second skin, familiar and unwelcome. It wasn't the kind of silence that offered rest. It was the kind that hummed beneath every interaction, loud in its restraint. Madeline hadn't spoken since that afternoon. Not a single word. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply was, existing in small movements and long glances that meant more than full conversations. She didn't flinch when her father entered the room anymore, but she didn't seek him out either. She would sit on the edge of the couch with a doll in her lap, brushing its hair with a plastic comb in repetitive, measured strokes. Ethan tried, clumsily at first. He brought her toys she no longer cared for, asked if she wanted to go for walks she wouldn't take. His voice would trail off mid-sentence when she didn't reply. It wasn't that she was ignoring him. It was worse. It was like he wasn't quite real to her yet, like she was still waiting for him to disappear the way adults always seemed to when she needed them most. And Ethan, though present in body, was constantly reminded that love could not be willed. It had to be earned. Estela noticed it first, the way Madeline tilted her head when a bird passed the window, or how she lingered in the hallway when the gardener passed carrying pots of bright yellow blooms. It was in those silent cues that Estela began to understand the language Madeline now used. Not English, not whispers, but attention. One morning, as Rosa packed their bags quietly in the laundry room, expecting the dismissal to come at any moment, Estela sat across from Ethan at the long kitchen island, legs swinging. "She likes sunflowers," she said plainly, without looking up from her cereal. Ethan blinked. It had been 3 days since anyone had offered him information that felt like a gift rather than a report. "Sunflowers," he echoed. Estela nodded, spoon halfway to her mouth. She used to point at them in the picture books. "When your wife—" She paused, then rephrased, "When Victoria wasn't around." Ethan didn't respond right away, but something in the way Estela said, "when Victoria wasn't around," made his jaw tighten. That night, he called the landscaper and gave him a simple instruction. "Fill the back garden with sunflowers, as many as you can." The next morning, Madeline stopped in the hallway that led to the back patio. Through the glass doors, the garden looked different, like someone had painted it overnight. Yellow, everywhere. Rows of sunflowers, their faces turned upward, standing tall like guardians. She said nothing, of course, but her hand pressed against the glass. Estela appeared beside her and whispered, "They're for you." Madeline didn't reply, but she glanced sideways at Ethan, who stood awkwardly behind them, watching. That glance, brief, uncertain, fragile, landed on Ethan like a tidal wave. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even trust. It was something much rarer. Curiosity. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could believe him next time. Ethan exhaled slowly, not wanting to break the moment. He didn't approach, didn't kneel or speak. He simply stood there, letting her know he saw her, and that for now was enough. Rosa watched from the doorway, clutching the hem of her apron with trembling fingers, feeling the shift in the air like a mother does. Instinctively, protectively, and with a deep ache in her chest she couldn't name. As the days continued, Estela became the unspoken bridge between father and daughter. She didn't try to fix things. She didn't push for conversations or coax Madeline into speaking. She just stayed near, reading aloud when Madeline sat beside her, playing cards in silence, humming old lullabies that her own grandmother used to sing. Ethan would often find them in the sunroom, the late afternoon light spilling over their heads like something holy. One day he brought in a small watercolor kit and left it on the table near the window. The next morning, he found a sunflower painted on a torn napkin. It wasn't signed, it wasn't acknowledged, but it was left in plain sight. A silent note passed between broken hearts. Estela never said whether Madeline painted it. She didn't have to. And Ethan, smart enough to understand the delicate rules of this new language, simply framed it and hung it in the hallway. No grand speech, no announcement, just proof that he'd seen it. And it mattered. Rosa, for her part, kept her distance in ways that only someone used to being invisible could. She continued her chores, made meals, folded linens. But she watched, and what she saw both humbled and terrified her. Her daughter, her child, had become something neither book nor prayer could teach, a quiet force for good. Rosa had always taught Estela to be cautious, to be polite, to remember her place. But Estela had ignored that place the day she stepped between a woman's cruelty and a child's fear. And now she was walking paths Rosa herself had never dared to tread. She worried that Ethan might take advantage of that he would lean too heavily on a child to repair the damage caused by adults. But each time she saw him hesitate before speaking or pause before reaching out, Rosa sensed that maybe he was learning too. Maybe this wasn't about dependence. Maybe it was about redemption. For all of them. Still, Rosa's heart stayed guarded. She had learned long ago that good things could vanish as quickly as they appeared. And so, the silence lingered, not quite painful anymore, but not healed either. Madeline still didn't speak, but she started drawing more. She touched Ethan's arm once when he passed her the crayons. She handed Estela a folded paper heart after dinner. These were her words now. And Ethan learned to read them, one careful gesture at a time. Estela stayed close, like sunlight, never demanding, always present. Rosa watched her daughter become more than she'd ever imagined and feared the weight it placed on her shoulders. But in the stillness of those late afternoons, when the girls sat together and Ethan watched without interrupting, Rosa allowed herself one fragile hope, that maybe this house, this cold, haunted place, was learning how to feel again. The sunflowers bloomed wildly in the garden, bright and defiant, and though no one said it out loud, they all knew. Every petal was a word Madeline didn't yet know how to speak. Estela never asked permission to begin writing the notes. There was no plan, no dramatic moment of inspiration. It began with a feeling, a hunch maybe, that Madeline needed to see what couldn't be said. The first note was short. "You're brave," it read, scribbled in blue pen on the corner of a folded napkin. Estela tucked it between the pages of Madeline's favorite picture book, a story about a fox who finds its way home. She didn't expect a reaction. In fact, she left the note and walked away without a word. Later that evening, she noticed that the book had been pulled from the shelf, the page slightly creased. The note was gone. Estela didn't mention it. The next day she left another, this time placed neatly beside Madeline's juice glass during snack time. "I believe in you." Simple, honest. It was never about coaxing a thank you or a smile. Estela wasn't doing it to get anything back. It was her way of keeping the connection warm, of making sure Madeline never again felt like silence meant invisibility. Rosa noticed, of course. She always noticed, but she didn't interrupt. She understood the sacredness of that quiet language between girls who knew too much. Over the following week, the notes began to multiply. Estela wrote them during lunch breaks, before bed, while waiting for Rosa to finish her duties. Some were simple affirmations. "You matter." "It wasn't your fault." Others were more personal. "I miss your voice." "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Madeline never responded in writing, never left her own notes behind, but she kept them, every single one. Estela discovered this one afternoon when she went searching for a missing sock under the bed in the guest room and spotted the edge of a small wooden box poking out from beneath the dust ruffle. She didn't open it. She wouldn't invade that privacy. But when Madeline saw her glance toward it, she didn't flinch or move to hide it either. That night, as they got ready for bed, Estela said softly, "They're yours now. You don't have to share them with anyone." Madeline didn't say anything, but she leaned against Estela's shoulder and stayed there until sleep began to claim her. That was answer enough. Ethan remained an outsider to the exchange, though he sensed its importance. He watched Estela with increasing awe, realizing that she had a gift not just for comforting, but for translating pain into presence. One afternoon, he passed by the sunroom and paused at the threshold. Madeline sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully folding a new note into a triangle. Estela was nearby, pretending not to notice, but her eyes flicked up just long enough to meet Ethan's. She gave a small nod, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. She was letting him witness something sacred. That same night, as Ethan passed Madeline's room, the door slightly ajar, something caught his eye. The wooden box. It sat open on the bed, and inside, the notes were spread out like petals. Some were creased, others smoothed, each one placed with deliberate care. Ethan stepped inside the room cautiously, not wanting to startle her. Madeline wasn't there. She must have been with Rosa or Estela. He didn't touch the notes, but he stared at them long enough to feel their weight. A lifetime of silence was being slowly unraveled, one paper at a time. It stunned him, the elegance of it, the quiet rebellion against everything Victoria had tried to destroy. Without overthinking it, Ethan walked back to his office and opened a drawer. He pulled out a sheet of plain white stationery, paused, then slowly began to write. "You taught me how to listen. No signature, no flourish, just the truth." He folded the paper into a square and waited until the house was still, then crept into Madeline's room and gently placed the note in the center of the wooden box, among the petals of affirmation and friendship. There was a strange vulnerability in what he had done, like he had submitted a piece of himself to a test he might fail. Would she read it? Would she understand? Would it matter at all? He didn't know. And for the first time in his adult life, he was okay with not knowing. He just hoped that somewhere inside her, a thread had been tugged, that maybe she would see his message for what it was, not an apology, but a promise. The following day, the box remained closed. Madeline said nothing, offered no indication that she had found the new note. Ethan carried on as usual, helping Rosa with breakfast dishes, watching Estela read to Madeline in the sunroom, responding to work emails he could barely concentrate on. By evening, he had almost convinced himself that the note had gone unnoticed. But when he passed Madeline's room before dinner, he saw the box had moved. It now sat atop the dresser, still open. A single new paper had been added to the pile, not folded, not hidden, just resting at the top. Ethan stepped closer and saw it was written in the same shaky, childlike handwriting he hadn't seen in 2 years. One word. "Thank you." He stood frozen, the world narrowing to that fragile slip of paper. It wasn't just a word. It was a doorway, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. It was proof that she had heard him, that she had let him in, even if just a little. Ethan didn't speak of it. He didn't show Rosa, didn't mention it to Estela. He simply went back downstairs, his expression unreadable. But something in his posture had changed, just a little straighter, a little lighter. Later that night, when Madeline walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, Ethan simply handed her the glass and smiled. No words. She nodded, clutching the rim with both hands, and returned to her room. The silence between them had shifted. It was no longer made of absence. It was made of understanding, and upstairs, in her bed, Estela turned onto her side, unaware of the note that had changed everything. But Madeline knew. She placed the wooden box back under her bed and climbed in beneath the covers. For the first time in a long time, she slept with both hands outside the blanket, unafraid. The Callahan mansion had always been impressive from the outside. Towering columns, arched windows, polished stone. A structure that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, rather than in a story about grief and healing. But inside, Estela saw it for what it really was. A house with too much space and not enough soul. She realized it during one of the slow afternoons when Rosa was busy folding linens and Madeline was hovering behind her like a shadow. Estela took her hand without a word and wandered through the hallways, letting instinct guide them. They passed a library filled with untouched classics, a sitting room where the plastic covers still clung to the edges of furniture, and a sunken lounge that felt more like a showroom than a space where people actually lived. "This place doesn't like kids," Estela said aloud, not expecting a response. Madeline, silent as always, squeezed her hand in agreement. That's when it began, the mapping. Estela started drawing little floor plans on scraps of paper, marking safe rooms with stars and labeling others with codes, places to avoid when adults were angry, spots where secrets whispered better. Madeline followed her lead, always quiet, but always attentive. As their explorations deepened, so did their companionship. They discovered a storage room behind the main staircase, filled with dusty toys and old furniture, forgotten things that once belonged to someone Madeline might have been before her mother died. Estela, unfazed, knelt down and pulled out a box of building blocks. "We can make a fort," she suggested. Madeline blinked. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. They began constructing it right there in the hallway, two girls building something no one had ever given them, permission to belong. Rosa caught them that evening, and her reaction was instant. "Madeline, honey, you shouldn't be in this mess. Estela, this isn't your place. We shouldn't touch what's not ours." But Estela stood firm, not with defiance, but with conviction. "It's not anyone's. It's just dust and silence. We're making it better." Before Rosa could argue further, Ethan entered the hallway, having heard the commotion. He didn't scold. He didn't ask why his daughter was sitting cross-legged on a moth-eaten rug, surrounded by toy dinosaurs and loose crayons. He looked at Estela, then down at Madeline, and said, "Would you help me fix the playroom?" Estela didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on Ethan, this man who once seemed carved from steel, now asking a child for guidance. "What do you want it to look like?" she asked. Ethan exhaled. "Not like the rest of this place," he said. And with that, something shifted. Over the next few days, the forgotten playroom, once a hollow, echoing space with 2 broken shelves and a sagging couch, began to transform. Estela chose colors, picking warm tones instead of the cold whites and grays that defined the rest of the mansion. Ethan ordered what she suggested: soft rugs, beanbags, glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling. Rosa helped with curtains, sewing them during her breaks, choosing a cheerful fabric covered in storybook animals. Even Madeline contributed, pointing at the shelf where she wanted the books to go, or choosing between 2 lampshades with the slightest raise of an eyebrow. No one mentioned the silence that still hovered, but everyone worked around it like dancers avoiding broken glass. The house, piece by piece, was being taught how to embrace without arms. When the last cushion had been placed and the final storybook shelved, Estela stood back, arms folded, critically inspecting the room. Ethan watched her with quiet admiration. "You have an eye for this," he said. Estela shrugged, but her cheeks flushed. "It's not hard to know what feels like home. You just have to remember where it hurts not to have one." Ethan didn't reply, but the way he nodded said he understood more than he could say. That night, he left the playroom door open on purpose, the soft light spilling into the hallway like an invitation. Madeline wandered in just before bedtime, barefoot and cautious. She scanned the room, as if waiting for someone to tell her she wasn't allowed. No one did. Estela was already inside, sprawled on a beanbag, flipping through a comic book. "Come on," she said, patting the space beside her. And Madeline came, slowly but willingly. She sat, cross-legged, and watched Estela make a goofy face at one of the characters. Then it happened. A sound, brief, airy, barely a note, but unmistakable. A laugh. Ethan, who had been standing at the doorway unnoticed, felt his throat close. It wasn't a belly laugh or even a giggle. It was more like a breath that remembered how to be joyful, a sound he hadn't heard since before the accident, before the funeral, before Victoria's cruelty turned everything hollow. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, afraid that if he acknowledged it, the moment might shatter. But inside him something cracked open, not pain but release, a kind of quiet gratitude that his daughter, in her own time, had decided to come back to life. Rosa passed behind him, her hands full of folded laundry, and stopped mid-step. She looked at Ethan, who looked at her. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The laugh had done what months of therapy and apologies couldn't. It reached in and said, "She's still here. You didn't lose her completely." That night, as Ethan turned off the lights in the house one by one, he paused by the playroom. The girls had left it messy, pillows scattered, books half open, a juice box forgotten on the table. But it wasn't disorderly. It was lived in, real. The house had absorbed their presence like thirsty roots drink in water. It wasn't healed, not yet, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel cold. And as Ethan stood there, listening to the quiet, not as absence but as peace, he smiled to himself. Because even houses, he realized, could learn how to hug if someone just taught them how. The courtroom buzzed with tension from the moment they walked in. Rosa held Estela's hand firmly, while Ethan walked just behind them, with Madeline nestled against his side. She was wearing a navy blue dress and holding tight to the sleeve of his coat, eyes lowered, lips pressed shut. Inside, everything felt too big. The wooden benches, the vaulted ceiling, the distant faces that turned and whispered. The attorneys circled like sharks. Victoria sat at the defense table, immaculately dressed, her hair pinned back, her smile thin and venomous. Her lawyer was loud, theatrical, making his voice echo with every objection and every attempt to paint her as misunderstood. He called Ethan negligent, claimed Rosa manipulated the situation, and implied Estela had been coached. But through it all, the two girls sat silently, grounded in something far deeper than any adult in the room could fabricate. They weren't props. They were the story itself. And when Estela's name was called, the room shifted. The noise died. The posturing stopped. Everyone turned to watch the 12-year-old girl rise from her seat, walk past the polished mahogany tables, and take the stand. No one could prepare for what came next, not even her mother. Estela didn't fidget. She didn't glance nervously at Rosa or Ethan or even the judge. She sat up straight, legs barely touching the ground, and waited until the oath was read. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud, but it was steady, clear. "I saw Mrs. Grab Madeline's arm and push her," she began. She was yelling. Madeline didn't say anything, just cried. "I told her to stop." The prosecutor asked if this had happened more than once. Estela nodded. Many times, sometimes with words, sometimes with her hands. Madeline was always quiet after. Like scared quiet, the kind that hurts your stomach. No embellishments, no theatrics, just the plain, sharp-edged truth. The defense lawyer tried to rattle her, suggesting Estela was just a child, too young to understand adult discipline. She didn't blink. "Calling a child trash and locking her in a closet isn't discipline," she said. "It's cruelty." The room held its breath. The judge leaned forward slightly, one hand curled under her chin. It wasn't just the words, it was the purity of them. The unwavering moral clarity of a girl who had nothing to gain and yet risked everything to protect someone smaller. When Estela stepped down, the prosecutor didn't even try to ask for more. It was enough. The silence she left behind spoke louder than any final statement. As she returned to her seat, Rosa brushed her hand against her daughter's back, not in praise, but in solidarity. Ethan mouthed a silent "thank you" across the aisle, but the room's attention shifted as the judge turned to Madeline. "Would you like to say something, sweetheart?" she asked, her tone gentle, no pressure, just possibility. Madeline looked up at her father, then at Rosa, and finally at Estela, who gave her the smallest nod, not urging, not expecting, just offering quiet strength. Madeline reached into the little pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slightly crumpled from being held so tight. Her hand trembled as she rose and walked toward the bench. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply stepped forward and handed the note to the judge. The courtroom watched, spellbound. The judge opened the note slowly. Her eyes scanned the small, slanted handwriting. A pause, then she read it aloud, her voice soft but sure. "No one should be afraid at home." It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a verdict delivered by a child too young to know legal jargon, but old enough to understand safety, fear, and love. There was no sound in the room as she folded the note again. Victoria's face was unreadable now. Not triumphant, not confident, just still. The defense lawyer stood but didn't speak. What was left to say? The judge took a long moment, letting the weight of the silence settle before she looked back at Madeline. "Thank you for your courage," she said. "That will be enough." And it was. From that point forward, the proceeding moved quickly. The judge issued a protective order, immediate and clear. Victoria was to have no further contact with Madeline, not directly, not through intermediaries. Visitation rights were denied. The court would review the situation in 6 months, but the message was unmistakable. Madeline was no longer invisible. She had spoken in her own way, and the world had finally listened. Ethan held her tightly, whispering reassurances that would never be repeated aloud, but that only a father and daughter would understand. Rosa wept quietly into a tissue. Estela leaned against her mother's shoulder, drained but at peace. For once, justice didn't look like anger. It looked like truth, calmly spoken and quietly honored. When the hearing adjourned, no one rushed to leave. They stood there for a few lingering moments, letting the finality of it all soak in. Ethan knelt in front of Estela and said, "You didn't just protect Madeline. You gave her voice back." Estela looked unsure of how to react. Compliments still felt foreign, like borrowed clothes. But then Madeline reached over and took her hand, not hiding behind her father, not shielding herself, just standing beside Estela as equals, as friends. They exited the courtroom together, not in silence, but without the need for words. The hardest things had already been said. The truths no one else dared name had already been named, by children, no less. And so, as they stepped into the open air outside the courthouse, the adults still recovering from the emotional weight of the hearing, the two girls walked ahead. Rosa and Ethan followed behind, side by side for the first time, without walls between them. They weren't a family. Not yet. But something had changed, something had begun, and inside Ethan's coat pocket, the note Madeline had given the judge remained, folded with care. A single sentence that had, in the end, said everything that needed to be said. No one should be afraid at home. Even after the courtroom had fallen silent, and Victoria's presence had been legally and permanently removed from their lives, Ethan Callahan couldn't find rest. The weight of relief was heavy, but the weight of guilt was heavier. In the days that followed the hearing, he found himself pacing through the hallways of his mansion, like a man searching for something he couldn't name. He couldn't stop replaying the memories, the birthday he missed because of a business meeting, the bruises he hadn't noticed beneath Madeline's sweaters, the mornings when she wouldn't eat, and he chalked it up to being a picky eater. But mostly, it was the look she gave him in the courtroom, that broken trust behind her silent eyes that haunted him. How had he let someone like Victoria live under the same roof, wielding cruelty behind manicured smiles, while he convinced himself he was rebuilding a home? And Estela, and that girl had stood between his daughter and danger. Where had he been? He started spending time in the garden, not to escape, but to observe. Sometimes he'd pretend to read on a bench, but his eyes followed the girls as they played. Madeline had begun to speak again, but sparingly, as if words were still under construction inside her. Estela remained her shadow, her translator, her shield. Rosa often sat on the steps nearby, sorting laundry or shelling peas into a bowl, but always watching, always present. It was during those afternoons that Ethan's language began to change. Not his speech, but his gestures. He started helping Rosa without being asked, setting the table, pouring juice for the girls, fixing the jam drawer in the kitchen that had been broken for years. He began to listen to Estela's stories about school and correct Madeline's math homework without judgment. And when Rosa once asked if he was working from home, he just shook his head. "I'm working on something more important," he said. But guilt is a quiet architect. It builds rooms in a man's heart that even love struggles to enter. At night, Ethan would lie awake thinking of how Estela had looked on the witness stand, so small and yet so brave. He'd never heard anyone speak like that before, not in boardrooms or business pitches. She didn't hedge. She didn't calculate impact. She just told the truth. And what did that say about him? That it took a child to protect his own daughter from harm. The thought cut deeper than anything Victoria had ever said. He began to see all the places guilt had hidden in his life, in the silence he allowed, in the comfort he prioritized, in the appearances he trusted more than his instincts. He'd built a castle, but forgot to check the walls for cracks. He thought about the last family photo he had taken, just him and Madeline, both smiling with a kind of practiced joy, back when they were trying too hard to look okay. That evening, Ethan called Rosa into his office. She looked nervous, unsure if something was wrong. He waved off the formality, asking her to sit, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, he slid a photograph across the desk. Rosa picked it up and stared. It wasn't a stock image. It was them, taken just 2 days before in the backyard. Madeline on the swing, Estela pushing her, Ethan mid-laugh, hair wind-tossed, and Rosa looking on with a tired but honest smile. It was candid, imperfect, real. "I had it printed this morning," he said, voice softer than usual. "I didn't know what to say, so I thought maybe this could speak for me." Rosa looked up at him, eyes moist. "What are you asking, Mr. Callahan?" she whispered. He hesitated, then answered quietly, "I'm asking to earn a place in something I never built but want to protect. I'm asking if you'll let me be part of this, of you, all of you." That night, long after dinner had been cleaned away and the girls were upstairs, Ethan stood outside Estela's room. He could hear soft laughter from inside, the kind that comes only when children feel safe. He knocked gently and waited. No answer, but he stepped in anyway. The room was dim. Estela's side of the room decorated now with books, drawings, and small notes pinned above the headboard. Madeline was already asleep, curled under the blanket. Estela looked up from her bed but didn't speak. Ethan said nothing either. He simply walked to her desk and placed a white envelope on the wooden surface. Then, with a nod, he turned and left. Inside the envelope was the photograph, the one of the four of them, and beneath it, a note handwritten in slightly uneven cursive, "If you'll let me try." Estela didn't open the envelope right away. She just stared at it, heart pounding in her chest like a drum no one else could hear. She knew what it meant, even before she unfolded the flap. When she finally did, carefully so as not to wake Madeline, she took out the photo and the note. Her eyes lingered on the words, tracing them over and over. "If you'll let me try." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an apology. It was something braver, an invitation to hope. She tucked the photo beneath her pillow and held the note in her hands for a long time. And downstairs in his study, Ethan sat in the dark, wondering if one sentence could ever be enough to start building something new. The first storm of autumn rolled in on a quiet Sunday afternoon, but it wasn't the thunder or the lightning that unsettled Madeline. It was something far older, far deeper, that the rain seemed to stir inside her. She sat by the window for hours, knees tucked against her chest, eyes following the trails of water weaving down the glass like fingers trying to find their way back. No one had said anything cruel. No one had touched her. And yet the tears began, slowly at first like the rain, then heavier like a memory she couldn't name had cracked open inside her chest. Estela found her like that, silent and trembling. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't try to reason it out. She simply draped a soft blanket over Madeline's shoulders, sat beside her, and started talking. Not about the storm or the past, but about made-up princesses who tamed dragons with hot chocolate and secret caves hidden beneath school playgrounds. Stories full of color and warmth and magic. Madeline didn't speak, but slowly, as Estela's voice filled the room, her tears quieted, and eventually, lulled by the rhythm of safety, she fell asleep on Estela's lap. Ethan had been watching from the hallway, unsure whether to enter or to retreat. He stood there, unmoving, as if afraid that any step might shatter the delicate balance unfolding in front of him. There was something sacred in the way Estela cradled Madeline's head, in the way she wove joy out of sorrow without needing to solve or analyze it. It wasn't what Ethan would have done. He would have asked questions, tried to fix it, explained too much. But Estela didn't fix. She stayed. And Ethan realized, perhaps for the first time, that love sometimes looked like patience, like choosing to sit beside someone in their quiet rather than drag them out of it. He felt both gratitude and helplessness surge in his chest. There was still so much he didn't know about being a father, not just to Madeline, but to this strange and beautiful new bond that was forming between all of them. He turned away before Estela could see him. That moment wasn't his to interrupt. It was theirs, and maybe, for now, that was enough. The next morning, the storm had passed, but something of it lingered in the air. A tenderness, a softness in how everyone moved. Ethan was the first one awake. He stood in the kitchen awkwardly, surrounded by cabinets he didn't quite know how to navigate, looking for a frying pan that somehow always seemed to disappear. For years, breakfast had been a thing managed by staff or skipped entirely in the rush to get to meetings. But today, he wanted to make it himself. He burned the toast, the eggs were a little runny, and he added way too much sugar to Madeline's cereal. When Rosa came downstairs and saw the mess, she opened her mouth, then closed it again, smiling without comment. Estela appeared next, tying her hair into a loose braid, and raised an eyebrow at the chaos. Ethan gave a sheepish shrug. "I'm learning," he said. Estela didn't reply. She just grabbed the burnt toast and began scraping the blackened edges into the sink like it was no big deal. And when Madeline came in, rubbing her eyes, still groggy but calmer, she walked straight to the table and sat beside her father without hesitation. Breakfast was filled with mismatched utensils, spilled juice, and unevenly buttered bread, but it was also filled with something else, laughter, small but real. Madeline smiled when Ethan exaggerated his toast disaster and even giggled when Estela teased him about it being a science experiment gone wrong. Rosa watched it all from the corner, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart full and cautious. This wasn't just a good morning. It was a new morning. One where love didn't have to be perfect to be present, where healing could sneak in through burnt breakfast and unspoken forgiveness. And when breakfast was over and the plates were a mess, no one rushed to clear them. Instead, they sat a little longer, letting the warmth of ordinary moments settle into their bones. After everyone had finished eating, Madeline disappeared into the living room with her markers and colored pencils. She didn't say much, but she worked with quiet intensity, tongue poking slightly out between her lips the way she always did when she was focused. 30 minutes later, she came back, gripping a sheet of paper in her small hand. "Daddy," she said softly, tugging on Ethan's sleeve. He turned to her, surprised, not just by the word, but by the trust it carried. She handed him the drawing. 3 figures stood in the center, a tall man, a young girl with curly hair, and a smaller girl in a red dress. Above them, the sky was painted a brilliant, blazing orange. "Is this us?" he asked gently. Madeline nodded. Then, without a word, she reached for Estela's hand and placed it over the paper too. They stood like that for a moment, a triangle of fingers and crayon colors, saying nothing because nothing else needed to be said. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked into the kitchen and taped the drawing onto the refrigerator door. The lines weren't perfect, and the colors bled in places, but he had never seen anything more beautiful. The drawing stayed there, untouched, unbothered, as days passed and chores returned. Rain gave way to sunshine, but no one dared take it down. That simple piece of paper, crinkled at the corners and vibrant with childlike hope, became a quiet monument to everything they were beginning to rebuild. And even when the sky outside cleared completely, even when laughter became a daily sound and not a rare gift, the drawing remained. It reminded them all, sometimes healing doesn't arrive with lightning. Sometimes it tiptoes in during a rainy Sunday, wrapped in a blanket and whispered through a crayon sky. It was the kind of afternoon no one remembers years later, a day not marked by storms or special events, just the slow rhythm of life settling into something like normal. Ethan was at his desk in the study, sifting through contracts he couldn't concentrate on, when he noticed a folded piece of paper lying neatly in the center of his desk. It hadn't been there an hour ago. He reached for it, curiosity replacing his mental fog. Unfolding it carefully, he saw the handwriting, steady, deliberate, a child's attempt at sounding brave through ink. "Have you ever thought about being our real dad?" The words stared up at him with more weight than any boardroom proposal or corporate merger had ever carried. He blinked, once, twice, then read it again and again, as if the meaning might shift, soften, give him room to breathe. But it didn't. It only deepened. He sat back in his chair, the breath caught in his throat. He felt like someone had knocked the wind out of him, not with force, but with gentleness, and somehow that hurt more. He didn't move, didn't speak. Somewhere else in the house, the faucet ran, the world moved on, unaware that something sacred had just landed on his heart. Downstairs, Rosa hummed softly as she washed dishes, her hands moving with muscle memory honed by years of repetition. She didn't know what had just unfolded 2 floors above her. She didn't know that her daughter, the girl she had raised with quiet strength and little more than faith, had slipped that note onto Ethan's desk with a courage that could shake the world. She didn't know that at that very moment, Ethan Callahan, the man with boardrooms at his feet and networks in his hands, sat completely still, undone by 12 simple words. And yet perhaps some part of her, the part that had watched the distance shrink between rooms, the part that had seen drawings on the fridge and burnt toast on the table, perhaps that part knew change was close. She dried her hands, glanced at the clock, and wondered whether to start dinner or give the girls a few more minutes to play. She never guessed that upstairs, a man was holding a piece of paper like it was a lifeline, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from realization. A realization that he had already been chosen, not by merit or money, but by love. Ethan didn't take the stairs 2 at a time. He didn't burst into the hallway like in movies. Instead, he walked, slowly, with intention. The paper still in his hand, crumpled slightly from how tightly he'd been gripping it. He stopped outside the girls' room, listened for a moment to the muffled giggles behind the door, the soft, weightless sound that had returned to his home only recently. Then he knocked once and opened the door without waiting for a reply. Estela looked up first, then Madeline. They were sitting on the floor, surrounded by books and little figurines, mid-story. Ethan stepped inside, heart pounding with something not quite fear, not quite hope. He lowered himself to one knee, not because it was dramatic, but because he needed to look them in the eyes without standing above them. He held out the note. "Was this from you?" he asked, voice soft, as if anything louder might break the spell. Estela nodded, her lips pressed together in a determined line. Madeline didn't speak, but her fingers reached out, slipping into his without hesitation, the same way she used to cling to him in silence, but now with trust. "I didn't know," Ethan began, but his throat closed up. He looked at both girls, Estela with her fierce, guarded hope, and Madeline with her quiet, desperate love. He tried again. "I didn't know how much I needed you until you were already here, until you showed me what I'd been missing." He looked at Estela. "You didn't just protect my daughter, you protected me too, from blindness, from ignorance." He looked at Madeline, whose eyes shimmered. "And you waited, even when I failed to see you." Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Their silence was full of answers. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he placed the note down on the rug beside them, as though it had become a sacred relic. He exhaled finally and added, "If you'll let me, I want to try, not just as someone who takes care of you, but as someone who belongs to you, all the way." Madeline moved first. She wrapped her arms around Ethan's neck, pressing her face into his shoulder like she had done once when she was small and storms frightened her. Only now, she was the one bringing calm. Ethan's arms closed around her instinctively, pulling her close, letting the moment settle into something real. Estela stayed seated, watching. For a second, Ethan feared she might retreat, might change her mind, but then she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's be a family," she said, the words light but deliberate, as if she had rehearsed them in her mind a dozen times. Ethan turned toward her, his throat tight, and nodded. No speeches, no grand declarations, just a truth spoken quietly in a room where it finally felt safe to be heard. He didn't have to convince them, they had already decided. Outside, the world remained unchanged. Dishes still drying on racks, birds flying past windows, neighbors walking dogs. But inside that room, the axis of their lives had shifted. A question asked without a sound had been answered without conditions. In the days ahead, they would still face awkward moments, old habits, things to learn. But this moment, this one, was clean and true. A beginning, not promised but chosen. Ethan sat on the floor with his daughters, because yes, that was what they were now, even if no papers had been signed, and let the stillness hold them. And somewhere in that stillness, something ancient and necessary finally clicked into place. The understanding that sometimes the loudest promises are made without a single word. Months had passed, but they hadn't disappeared. They had built themselves into the walls, into routines, into laughter that didn't have to be coaxed anymore. The Callahan house was no longer a fortress built to contain pain, but a home softened by new rituals and quieter forms of love. Mornings began with the smell of burnt toast that no one dared complain about, and evenings often ended with all four sitting on the living room carpet, sharing stories or just being near each other without needing to fill the silence. Ethan still struggled to tie ponytails, Rosa still over-apologized for helping too much, and Estela still left notes, even though Madeline didn't need them like before. Or maybe she did, but for different reasons. "Don't forget your lucky sock," one had read that morning. Another simply said, "First day of forever." Madeline kept them all, still in that little wooden box under her bed, though now it overflowed, and sometimes Ethan would step on a rogue note and smile instead of scold. The house had not been rebuilt. It had been rewritten, and that was something entirely different. It didn't erase the past, but it made room for the future. The day of the adoption hearing came without fanfare. No dramatic sunrise, no sudden thunder, just a clear Tuesday morning that happened to hold the weight of a lifetime. Rosa braided Madeline's hair with a trembling hand, and Ethan stood awkwardly by the mirror, adjusting his tie for the 6th time. Estela, as always, stayed calm, or at least looked it, but her thumb rubbed the side of her jeans in that nervous way Ethan had learned to recognize. When they arrived at the courthouse, Madeline gripped Estela's hand so tightly that neither of them noticed. It wasn't nerves. It was something bigger, something unspoken. Ethan and Rosa exchanged glances across the courtroom hallway, and in that glance was everything they had survived, not just as individuals, but together. They sat in silence as the judge began the formalities, the paperwork, the legal language meant to mark the change. But for them, it wasn't the judge's words that mattered. It was what had already happened in the ordinary, messy days leading up to this one. And right before they were called inside, Madeline pulled a folded paper from her jacket pocket and turned to Estela. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Estela opened the note slowly. It was written in purple crayon, Madeline's favorite, and the letters were large and a little uneven but full of certainty. "You saved me when I had no voice. Now I call you my sister." Estela froze, her breath catching somewhere between her chest and her throat. She blinked once, then again. Rosa, behind her, put a hand gently on her shoulder as if to anchor her. Ethan, standing just to the side, noticed the way Estela's fingers trembled slightly. For all the strength she carried, for all the fire that had made her stand between a grown woman and a frightened child months ago, it was this tiny letter that undid her. She didn't say anything. Instead, she reached into her pocket and took out her own note. She hadn't planned to give it today, hadn't even planned to write it, but something had pushed her last night. She placed it into Madeline's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Forever works both ways," it read. "I will always stand in front of you." Madeline didn't cry. She just smiled, leaned her forehead against Estela's, and held on. The judge had yet to say a word. Inside the courtroom, time felt suspended. The judge was kind, warm-eyed, and clearly moved by the silence that carried more truth than testimony. She read the forms, asked the required questions, and when Ethan, voice steady but softer than ever, confirmed his intention to adopt Estela Martinez as his legal daughter, Rosa exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When the judge finally declared it official, a murmur rippled through the room. Not applause, not noise, but a kind of collective release. Estela looked at Ethan, who nodded as if to say, "You were always mine." Madeline reached out and took both their hands. Rosa, standing beside them, wiped a tear and laughed under her breath. It wasn't the loud joy of movies. It was better. It was rooted in something deeper, the relief of being seen, chosen, named. The four of them walked out of the courtroom, not as employer and employee, not as guest and host, not even as protector and protected. They walked out as something simple and sacred, family. On the courthouse steps, Ethan bent down and lifted both girls into his arms. It wasn't graceful. Estela was tall for her age, and Madeline squealed when his grip tickled her ribs. But he didn't care. He just held them tightly, like anchoring himself to this one, undeniable truth. They were his daughters. Rosa stood a few steps behind, her eyes shimmering, her hands instinctively wringing together, until Ethan turned, extended one hand toward her, and said without hesitation, "You're part of this too." She stepped forward, hesitant at first, then all at once. She took his hand, not as a housekeeper, not even as a mother watching from the edges, but as someone who had helped build this new beginning. Their hands linked, and in that gesture was everything: pain endured, roles transformed, trust rebuilt. And as they walked down the steps together, the world didn't pause to notice. But maybe it didn't have to, because the people who mattered were already holding on to one another. Back at home, the girls disappeared into the hallway with laughter trailing behind them. Rosa paused in the kitchen, placing her keys on the counter like someone settling in, not just for the evening, but for good. Ethan followed them to Madeline's room, where she reached under her bed and pulled out the wooden box, now worn at the corners from so much opening and closing. She gently added her last letter to it, placing it carefully on top of the others like a crown. Estela stood beside her, watching in silence, her arms loosely crossed but her eyes tender. Ethan leaned against the doorway, taking in the sight without interrupting. He knew now, not just in theory, not just on paper, that family wasn't something you inherited or earned. Sometimes it was something you fought for. Sometimes it was written in crayon. Sometimes it lived in notes folded 3 times and hidden under beds. That night, the box remained there, tucked safely away. It no longer needed to speak for anyone. It was simply a reminder of how far they'd come. And that sometimes families are made, not of blood, but of courage, tenderness, and notes left in a box. We put our hearts into every story we bring here, because we know how much these moments can touch your soul, just like they touched ours while creating them. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. It's your support that helps us continue crafting stories that matter, stories that speak to the quiet bravery and deep tenderness in everyday lives. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing how this story resonated with you. We truly read each one. And if you feel like staying a little longer with us, there are more heartfelt stories waiting for you in our videos. Thank you for being here. It means the world to us.